Oh, thank you, Villanova. Thank you, Villanova. That sounds like a rock concert, doesn't it? You were great. It's such a joy to be back. Thank you for coming here instead of the lacrosse game. I had some concerns. But it is a joy to be back tonight to talk with you about the work that I've been doing in religion and culture, and especially this work that I know you're here to hear about, which is about religion in the books and films of the Harry Potter saga. Very quickly, I want to thank Chris and the people in his office, Marcy, who arranged my travel plans, Father Joe, who's back there keeping watch over things. And I would like to thank the folks from the Villanova bookstore. I have hauled books around before, and so I'll just say this to you. If this were a performance or if we were in a nightclub, I would encourage you to tip your waiter. So if any of the things that I say tonight are interesting to you, do feel free to take a look at those books. I'm happy to sign them, and I've got this really nice pen from the Villanova Conference Center. And I'm just itching to try it out. So last March when I was here, and we figured out it was almost exactly the same time. I think I was here last March, around March 10th. And I'm wondering first, did anybody come to hear me talk about U2? Okay, a couple of folks. And the rest didn't come. I think that's interesting in some ways. I said last year, okay, well there is that. I said last year that I thought that if Augustine were still around, he would be a big fan of Bono and U2. And I'm not sure I can say the same for our topic tonight, but since I was asked to explore Augustinian themes in the Harry Potter novels and films, I want to do that, and I want to do that seriously, and I have already done that in the book, but I wanted to do it a little bit more, especially tonight for your campus. In some ways, it makes perfect sense. We know, you have heard this a number of times, Augustine is the most formative thinker in the Western world. Rowling's Harry Potter books are the best-selling fictional narrative of all time, the story of our generation, maybe of our century. And the films based on them are the top-grossing film series of all time. They've made more money than the James Bond films, than the Star Wars films. And so the two clearly start with this in common, whether or not you have ever read Augustine or Rowling. And I'm guessing that if you're here tonight, you have read probably both. Both of them have shaped the world we live in. Good, and that actually is all the special effects you can hope for tonight. So here's where I think I'd like to start. Last summer, when the last part of Deathly Hallows came out, I was in England working on a book that I just finished. And so I was there as they prepared to do the Trafalgar Square opening, as people came from all over the world to camp out there in that kind of iconic location in London. And I was doing lots of media. I talked to the New York Times. I talked to BBC Radio. I talked to Men's Health. Men's Health wanted to run a feature on what men can learn from Harry Potter. And in fact, if you Google Men's Health and Harry Potter, this article will come up. But one of the questions that they asked me over and over again, and we talked about this at dinner tonight, because to me it seemed like a stupid question, but over and over again, 40 times, by large media sources and small, they asked me, why is it such a big deal that this is the last Harry Potter movie? And since they ask you a question, and it is the New York Times, you have to actually answer them instead of say, well, duh. And so what I would say to them is, this is the story that has shaped the lives not just of the generation who grew up with it, but of the parents and grandparents who read it alongside them. It has been a meaning maker for many people. Whether or not you have seen all the films, read all the books, you are familiar with the story. And it is, in a very real sense, the most popular narrative of our lifetimes. I don't think there will ever be anything else like it. And then the question that they asked after that was a little bit smarter. Why has this story been so popular? And the answer that I usually gave them was basically this. It's the same answer I gave to Men's Health. Stories are popular in the life of a culture because they fit the needs of the people consuming them. Now, this is a very simple theoretical example of how cultural criticism works. If something is popular at a given time, it's because it is filling the needs of its audience. What needs was Harry Potter filling? It was teaching an entire generation of people what it meant to be human. It was teaching an entire generation of people what it meant to be just, charitable, kind, honorable. And at a time when the news is full of reports of the rise of what religious scholars call the nuns. And I'm not speaking of Augustinian sisters. I'm speaking of those people who on polls identify themselves N-O-N-E-S, as in none of the above. I'm not religious. I don't affiliate myself with any of your organized religion. Anytime a story fills important moral needs like this, it becomes even more important for us to talk about. And so tonight I want to talk about two of a number of Augustinian themes that we could find reflected in Harry Potter. There are a lot of them. One of the really interesting things about this is that I have discovered over the past few years that Augustine shows up just about everywhere you look. This will not be a surprise to you. But with a couple of possible exceptions, I'm not sure that J.K. Rowling and Augustine would agree about original sin, and I'm not sure that they would agree that salvation is found only within the walls of Mother Church. And I'm not sure of that, because the Potter novels are not theological. They're not written to express theology, although there's theology in them. So I don't know exactly what J.K. Rowling thinks. You could ask her if you could get near her. I heard actually from a representative of Miss Rowling during the writing of my book. And it was not about the interview that I was hoping to arrange with her. It was a nice sort of legal notice, encouraging me to be very, very careful about how much of her I quoted. And I was very careful. So here's what I want to talk about tonight, the two areas of Augustinian spirituality where I think we find connection between J.K. Rowling and Augustine. I want to talk about friendship and community. And I want to talk about love and desire, especially love as we think of it in terms of keratos, and desire as we think of it in terms of cupiditas, disordered desire. And so we're going to begin with friendship. Peter Brown wrote in his biography of Augustine that none of the church's formative minds thought so much or so well about friendship as Augustine did. Certainly, Augustine knew from his own life that friendship, broadly defined, is capable of pulling us away from our tendency toward self-love and selfishness and toward God. Love of our neighbor is, of course, the surest path toward God in Augustine's twofold commandment of love. And friendship is also essential to our lives as healthy, functioning spiritual beings. Augustine knew from his life, spent largely in community, that friends make laughter deeper, joy broader, sadness bearable. If such people are with us, he wrote of true friends, then times of grief or difficulty become less bitter. The heavy burdens become lighter, perceived obstacles are faced and overcome. And that almost sounds like Ron, Harry, and Hermione, doesn't it? For her part, Rowling chose to construct her 4,100-page epic about an orphan, an unloved orphan whose encounters with community and friendship shape him into the person that he's called to be, the hero that he becomes. When Rowling's saga begins, as you know in the first book, Harry is an orphan who believes himself, and for all intents and purposes is, alone in the world. One of the most heartbreaking lines in modern fiction is this one from Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, prompted by Harry's unexpected first letter from Hogwarts. No one ever in his whole life had ever written to him. If you know of a sadder sentence I'd be glad to hear it during question and answer. Harry is unloved by his nearest relatives, the horrifying Dursleys, who shut him away in a cupboard under the stairs. He is friendless at school because his cousin Dudley and Dudley's gang despise him. You may remember this description. At school, Harry had no one. Everybody knew that Dudley's gang hated that odd Harry Potter in his baggy old clothes and broken glasses. It is an aching loneliness. As a novelist myself, I can tell you that one of the things you try and do at the beginning of your story is to dig the deepest possible hole for your character. And this hole of loneliness is one of the deepest holes we find in contemporary fiction. And yet, during the course of his story, he meets with people who become a new family to him, who shape him, who uphold him in what he does, and finally who make it possible for him to carry out the great work to which he's called. Ultimately, Harry makes possible a world where old divisions are erased, old lines are blurred, a larger, more inclusive community can form, and all of this grows out of the bonds of his own friendship. So Harry's life, as we will see, reflects Augustine's understanding of human friendship. And I want to quote Donald Burt, and this is a longish quote, but it's, I think, very appropriate, and so I hope you'll forgive me. Everything that I say until I stop sounding like somebody else is Donald Burt. I'll put on a really smart voice. No. Augustine believed that our social nature is a true good. We are perfected as humans by our love for other humans. We are made happy when that love is returned. The most important expression of such reciprocal love is the love of friendship. As Augustine declares, in this world, two things are essential: a healthy life and friendship. God created humans so that they might exist and live. This is life, but if they are not to remain solitary, they must be friends. And so Burt goes on, friendship is the highest expression of a person's social nature. It's also the solid foundation for any society. The more a society becomes a society of friends, the more perfect it becomes as a society. This is a hard task, certainly impossible for all, and perhaps any society on earth. The difficulty becomes apparent once one begins to consider what is necessary in order to be a friend. All of that from Donald Burt. But this description of Burt's, of forming a society of friends, should resonate with those of us who love Harry Potter's story. As you think about that phrase, a society of friends, perhaps you're thinking about the Order of the Phoenix, old or new. Perhaps you're thinking about Dumbledore's army. Perhaps you're thinking of Ron, Hermione, and Harry, an organic unit. We could even think of the individual houses, or of the makeup as a whole of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I love saying that. Whenever people would complain to J.K. Rowling, why didn't you just get rid of Slytherin if that's where all the bad wizards come from? It's a logical question, right? She would always say that the presence of all four houses was necessary, it was in fact essential to form young wizards in the people they were called to be. And so in one of the first serious discussions of the Potter books, the critic Alan Jacobs wrote that the purpose of Hogwarts is not to teach students to use magic. I mean, clearly it is. If we left Neville where he was in first year, it would be a really sad thing. But he said, and this is what Dumbledore says as well, that Hogwarts exists to teach the moral discernment necessary to avoid the continued reproduction of dark wizards like Voldemort. So Dumbledore's task as headmaster is to teach his students how to live together, not just how to use magic. And the purpose of communities like Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry is to develop character. In reading the books, we follow Harry through a 7-year cycle of education. Using a metaphor that's familiar perhaps from your studies of Augustine, the idea of peregrinatio, of the spiritual journey, Rowling says that the Harry Potter epic is Harry's journey. And what matters in the course of this story is how Harry becomes a worthy person, a person who is capable of doing what is right. Much of that moral discernment comes in response to those in his life, to those in his house, to his friends, to those communities to which he belongs. And I think that's one of the things, by the way, that we tend to forget in our culture because we are so individualistic. We talk a lot about freedom. We don't like to talk very much about responsibility. And yet, Augustine says that our progress in the spiritual life is measured by how much we care about the common good, about our friends, about our communities, and not simply about our own selfish needs and wants. Augustine wrote in City of God that friendship is the glue that forges our human ties. He liked that metaphor, the idea of friendship as glue. It binds husband and wife, brother and sister, friend to friend, citizen to citizen. And Rowling clearly agrees that this is an important thing for human life. Not only did she foreground friendship and community in the Harry Potter epic, as we're hearing, but in one of the few instances of her talking about her work, in 2008, she gave the commencement address at Harvard. And the two things that she chose to talk to those brightest and best about were these: the two essential pieces of life wisdom J.K. Rowling wanted to pass along. The first was imagination. And what she meant by that was the sense of empathy and compassion that we have with other people, not just how well you draw a stick figure. The second thing was friendship. I mean, think about that. I know some of you are already planning when you get invited back to give the commencement speech. But it's a fairly big deal. You're being asked to distill your life's wisdom. And these are the two things that she chose to talk about. Having the imagination to be able to feel what somebody else is feeling, compassion, empathy, and the importance, the formative value of friendship. Now, this focus sets up a powerful spiritual reading for us of the Potter novels and films. Because one of the great spiritual truths in every wisdom tradition is that we have to recognize the importance and validity of others. Karen Armstrong argues, in fact, that no religion may be valid that does not place love and compassion at the heart of its belief system. It's something we hear often in Augustine, in Aquinas, in John Calvin, of all places. And although we're considering the Potter tales tonight largely from this Christian tradition, and Rowling identifies herself with the Christian faith. Some of you may know that she is a member of the Church of Scotland. Her children have been christened. She tells interviewers that she goes to church more often than for weddings and funerals. But even though we're thinking largely about things in Christian terms, we know that these truths about compassion and empathy are central to all the great wisdom traditions. So, although we find little that's religious in Harry Potter, until we get to the 7th novel, there's almost nothing that would identify the author in any way as partaking of the Christian faith. We find those 2 Bible verses inscribed in the cemetery. It's Harry's parents and Dumbledore's sister. And until then, mostly what we've got is a fairly accurate representation of post-Christian Britain. But although there is little of that identifiably religious, it's very clear that those lines about compassion and empathy are at the heart of everything that Rowling wants to write about. In another interview, she talked about how the thing she hates worst in the world is bigotry. The idea that people would be treated or treat others differently because of who they are, what they wear, how they act. And so I think it's interesting and really kind of beautiful that there are a number of characters in the Harry Potter epic that empathize beautifully. Now, probably the most obvious is Hermione Granger. And even though that empathy is often played for laughs, you remember a lot in the 5th and 6th novels when people thought house elves were funny. Still kind of are, actually. But Hermione is one of those people that is able to look past visible difference, the fact that somebody doesn't look or act exactly like she does, and to extend them compassion and empathy. She's able to do that pretty much across the board. Let me give you a couple of examples. You'll remember that at the beginning of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Harry has been marooned at his aunt and uncle's house all summer, without word from the Order, without word from Ron or Hermione. And when he meets up with them, he is so angry at them. He yells at them. "How would you like it?" he asks. And Hermione, instead of getting defensive, which is the reaction a lot of us would have, isn't it? Hermione listens to him, and then she says, "Harry, we're really sorry. You're absolutely right." Hermione is also the person who, in those sort of interminable conversations with Creature the house elf, is able to listen to his story and to empathize with him, even though Creature reviles Hermione as a mudblood, doesn't allow her to touch him. Because she has this power of imagination, the power to project her empathy and compassion, she can imagine his lot and his life, even understanding why he might have betrayed Sirius Black. So Hermione is one of Rowling's characters who displays that kind of compassion. Dumbledore is the other. You remember what Hagrid is always saying: trust people. Gives them second chances. More centrally, of course, our hero, Harry, learns these qualities, embraces them, becomes a sacrificial hero. The saga's villain, Voldemort, doesn't have these qualities of empathy, doesn't want them, and is destroyed physically and spiritually because he fails to see the importance of communion. We're going to talk a little bit about the contrast between Harry and Voldemort later. I think it's always interesting to sort of take a look at these kind of poles when an author sets them up, because it's clear that we're supposed to look at Harry and Voldemort as two sort of sides of the same coin. Harry very easily could have turned out as Voldemort did. But Rowling was clear that there are more villains besides Voldemort that occur in the real world because we fail to see our common humanity. In her Harvard speech, Rowling spoke about her time at Amnesty International, where she encountered the broken victims of power-hungry people. And also she saw the power of human good. And so her conclusion about empathy, which is where I think I want to leave this, is she told the people at Harvard, the power of human empathy, leading to action, saves lives and frees prisoners. Unlike any other creature on this planet, humans can learn and understand without having experienced. We are able, she says, to imagine the pains of another human being and respond to them. So she said this ability to empathize was not just a gift, it's a responsibility. When we refuse to empathize with each other, when we refuse to extend to each other that offer of friendship, then we become, in our own ways, people as badly damaged as those villains that we read about. Now, let's talk a little bit about the power of community. We said earlier that in America, we don't typically pay as much attention to community as we might. Any of you that have traveled in third world countries or two-thirds world countries know that typically there is much more of a sense of community and family than we experience here. If you've listened to political discourse over the last year, you hear a lot of people talking about how I want my freedom and I don't want to be responsible for anybody else. Now, what these spiritual teachings, both from Christianity and elsewhere, tell us, these teachings about community, is that Gryffindors don't just get to care for Gryffindors. They don't even just get to care for those in Hogwarts. To put it in Muggle terms, we don't get to pick and choose for whom we have compassion. The parable of the Good Samaritan teaches, and Augustine wrote, that all of us in the human family are neighbors. Friendship, Augustine said, begins with one's spouse and children, and from there moves on to strangers, but considering the fact that we have the same father, Adam, and the same mother, Eve, who will be a stranger? Every human being is neighbor to every other human being. Think about the implications of that for just a second. Think about them in your life. We're going to talk about them in Harry's world. What does it mean that, as Calvin goes on to say, we don't get to choose to be loving? We are called to love everyone. What I love about the Potter novels is that they are full of these unaccountable moments of grace, especially in those moments when mercy is rendered to people that we might think of otherwise as alien or enemy. If everybody is our neighbor, if love is to be extended to everybody, then these things make sense. Dumbledore's willingness to offer people a second chance is not naive. It's actually what we're commanded to do. Hermione's concern for all creatures, including goblins and house elves. Harry's mercy extended to Peter Pettigrew when Sirius and Lupin intend to kill him. Even his rescue of Draco Malfoy from the room of missing things in Deathly Hallows. Some of those things don't make sense in pragmatic human terms. But if we are all neighbors, if we are called to love everyone, then these are Rowling's narrative reminders that we're called to be in relationship, to recognize the needs of others, to forgive others even when they are different or difficult or disagreeable. And I know that this is hard. I struggle with it every single day because I am so often right. I may, in fact, even be sure I am right. But as Augustine said in words that were brought back into public discourse last week by Georgetown's president, Jack DeGioia, the way we relate to each other can't work in that way. Let us on both sides lay aside our arrogance. Let us not on either side claim that we have already discovered the truth. Let us seek it together. For only then may we seek it lovingly and tranquilly, if there be no bold presumption that it is already discovered and possessed by one or the other of us. Friendship allows the other person to be who he or she is. Harry does not have to turn Draco Malfoy into somebody else. Now, that doesn't mean that friendship doesn't call us to call out others when they are wrong. The life of Jesus certainly contains examples. So does the life of Harry Potter, when people are offered the invitation to change. Even at the end of Deathly Hallows, that most unlikely exchange between Harry and Voldemort, where Harry offers Voldemort one last chance to repent, to feel remorse. It's one of my favorite scenes in the whole series. It's not in the movies, of course. In the movie, Harry is an action hero. But this is what he says to Voldemort. You may remember this. I'd advise you to think about what you've done. Think and try for some remorse. It's your last chance. I've seen what you'll become otherwise. Be a man. Try. Now, by be a man, Harry means that Voldemort should put away his notions of being something more than a man and to embrace his humanity with all that comes with it. To be truly human is to be a person who seeks friendship. Although this is, unfortunately, something Voldemort will never do. In my book on Harry Potter, one of the chapters was on community, and I'll sum that up for you very quickly. I concluded that Harry Potter becomes the person he's called to be because of his interactions with his community. It's something very similar to what I discovered when I wrote my book on U2. And it reminds me an awful lot of the South African concept, which often is talked about by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It's a concept called Ubuntu. It's a very anti-Western concept because what Ubuntu means is I am because we are. I become the person that I am because of you. Because we walk together. Because we push against each other. We shape each other, we challenge each other, we love each other. So Harry learns formally and informally from everyone in his epic. From friends, from enemies, from teachers, the ones he loves, and maybe even especially the one he hates. By the time the series is concluded, it's clear to us that Harry's story is that community is absolutely essential to the work of formation, that we cannot become fully human without each other. Besides Harry, there's also this amazing example of Neville. And we were talking about Neville earlier, and when we look at Neville in the first 3 books, he is laughable. Maybe on up past that. I'm thinking of that moment in book 6 when the 4th years invite Harry to come into their compartment because they don't think Harry should have to sit with Neville. But when we look at book 7, we discover that during the course of the epic, Neville also has been formed. He is a verifiable hero by the end of the books. He has been shaped, formed. He has become a person who is capable of acting courageously and with self-sacrifice. Stanley Hauerwas has written that the most important task of Christians is to be part of a community capable of forming people with virtues sufficient to witness to God's truth in the world. Let me repeat that because it's one of my very favorite theological lines. The most important task of Christians is to be part of a community capable of forming people with virtues sufficient to witness to God's truth in the world. Or as he puts it elsewhere, the job of Christian community is to create people who with bravery and courage and self-sacrifice can push back against all of the horrifying things that our culture tells us we should be and do. It's to create a heroic and countercultural community, which is exactly what we discover in Harry Potter. One last thing about community. Theologically, we're taught that we're meant to live in community because we are made in the image of a God who lives in community. Before the first human, Adam, was created in one of the Genesis stories, and God mused that it was not good for him to be alone. Christians believe that God existed, and that God's existence was in the Trinitarian community. Father, Son, Holy Spirit living in self-giving and ever-returning love. It was Augustine, of course, who did much of that confusing, heavy lifting for us, helping us to try and come to an understanding of that mystery. But it's our recognition that we're made in the image of a God who is in community, ever in communion, is one more theological sort of nail in the coffin, suggesting that we really are meant to be in fellowship with each other as well. Jürgen Moltmann writes that Christians believe that the church is the lived-out Trinity. I love that idea. It is the community where mutual love is practiced, which corresponds to the eternal love of the Trinity. And so it is that we are formed within loving communities oriented toward God. And because we are made in the image of a God-oriented and loving community, we are most fully alive within those communities. There is actually a lot of really cool Trinitarian stuff in Harry Potter, but I'm probably the only one interested in it. So I'm going to stop there. Now, let's think about loneliness for a little bit. We talked about it at the beginning, the idea that when we first find Harry, he is in this position of solitude. And that happens throughout the books, even as he begins to make friends. This idea of solitude is one of the things that helps us to understand the Dark Lord's brokenness. because we know that Voldemort's essential solitude is self-chosen. He does not want to love, to be part of a larger community. It's the furthest thing from his mind. He considers it weakness instead of strength. So Voldemort doesn't understand, and in fact, he denigrates love and connection. You remember that wonderful moment in Book 7 where Voldemort is asking Harry what his secret weapon is this time. Is it love again? You can hear that with a sort of snake-voiced sneer. Is it love? But Dumbledore recognizes that strength is to be found only in friendship and affection. It's Dumbledore who forms the 2 iterations of the Order of the Phoenix. It's in his honor that Dumbledore's army is formed. It's he who constantly insists that Harry should include Ron and Hermione in his adventures and in his confidence. You'll remember at the beginning of Half-Blood Prince when Harry admits he's not told anyone about the contents of the prophecy that was made about him. Dumbledore approves his reticence, but then he urges him to relax his discipline in favor of your friends. I think they ought to know. You do them a disservice by not confiding something that's important to them. I didn't want to worry or frighten them, said Dumbledore, surveying Harry over the top of his half-moon glasses. Or perhaps to confess that you yourself are worried and frightened. You need your friends, Harry. As you so rightly said, Sirius would not have wanted you to shut yourself away. So, we've seen how we need others. It's all the way through the Harry Potter story. One of the things I often like to ask when I do speaking about Harry Potter is I like to see how many people think that Harry would have survived even the first novel without Ron and Hermione. Yeah, there is never a taker for that. And I think it is so interesting because we have this sort of archetypal idea of what heroes look like in our culture. Think about that scene in every action movie where the action hero is getting ready to go and fight the big bad. And he starts putting on his weapons, a pistol here and a grenade here and a machine gun belt over his shoulders. Usually, it's sort of a stirring montage. And then think about that scene in the Order of the Phoenix when Dumbledore's army first begins to train together. Think of the contrast between those two. One, highly individual, it's all about me. One, I am part of this larger community without whom I cannot succeed. I'm not going to sing this song. Clearly, my allergy voice is not up to it. This is one of the songs of the Sorting Hat. Not my favorite character either. But the Sorting Hat gets sort of interesting after Goblet of Fire. In Order of the Phoenix, at the beginning of the first year, when the first years come in to be sorted, the Sorting Hat sings this song about how he doesn't want to sort people anymore. Do you remember? Again, I'm not going to sing it, but... And never since the founders 4 were whittled down to 3 have the houses been united as they once were meant to be. And now the Sorting Hat is here, and you all know the score. I sort you into houses because this is what I'm for. But this year I'll go further. Listen closely to my song. Though condemned I am to split you, still I worry that it's wrong. Still I wonder whether sorting may not bring the end I fear. It's a pretty serious Sorting Hat song. By setting ourselves apart, whether it's in failing to confide in others or dividing ourselves from others, we make hells for ourselves. This is a spiritual death that's noted throughout many wisdom traditions. And it is, in Augustinian thought, especially if you look at the Rule of Augustine, the spiritual death that comes because we don't love and trust our community. When we are a part of that community, we are able to resist temptation. We are able to put aside our disordered desires. And we have that strength that community brings. I set out every morning to do the right thing. And I fail every day. Not all day, every day. But I can tell you that without a faithful community to walk beside me, to call me to account, as Augustine talks about in the Rule, to pray for me, to encourage me, I would fail a whole lot more often. So here's where I think I want to close, and then we'll take a little time for question and answer. I want to talk a little bit about desire and about the things that our culture finds important and the things that in Christian thought, and particularly Augustinian thought, we find important. And here I think is where I want to start. Over the course of the last year, when I've talked about Harry Potter, I've often gotten up and talked about Paris Hilton and Charlie Sheen and Kim Kardashian because I'm really interested in them. But here's the thing. The fact is, every one of you knows every one of those names. Why do you know them? Because they're famous. Why are they famous? Are they famous because they're good people? Are they famous because they're heroic people? No. When Augustine talked about caritas and cupiditas, he talked about the difference between living for God and living for things that we love that do not last. And almost all of the people that we adulate in our culture are people who pursue things that do not last. Whether it's money or beauty or sex or power. And I'm still actually stuck on my question, why are these people famous? And maybe you could have an answer for me during question and answer time. But here's the thing. When we look at Voldemort, we find a person who, as we said, does not have friends, a person who does not have a community which can correct him. And we find a person who is pursuing everything that he should not pursue. Now, you may know that J.K. Rowling is a classicist by training. And I can't tell you whether or not this is true, but this is what she says. She says the name Voldemort comes from the Old French. She says it means running from death. I say, okay. But if we think about what Voldemort does in his pursuit of things that ultimately do not last, the evils he perpetuates, the things that he does, there is this very clear sense that, as we said, we've got Harry on one side set up as a self-sacrificial hero, and Voldemort set up on the other side as someone who is pursuing the things that ultimately will not last, no matter how hard he works, no matter how fast he runs from death. Now, it was a little bit gaudy, but I still felt a twinge of sympathy for Voldemort in the last movie. You could see the fear in his eyes as one Horcrux after another was destroyed. You could see how spiritually empty he was with nothing to fall back on. And of course, because there is no one he trusts, no one with whom he can share, it's very sad. Now, Harry is at his best when he lives for those things that are of what we might call eternal significance. And Harry is what we would call, in literary critical terms, a Christ figure. And I always want to be careful when I say this. Harry is not Jesus. Okay? But when we talk about a Christ figure in a novel or a TV series or in a film, we are talking about someone whose life has the basic shape of the gospel narrative. We are typically talking about someone who embodies the values of Christ: love, compassion, the ability to reach out to people who are on the margins, And often our Christ figures are identified by a figurative, it's rarely a literal, death and resurrection. Now, in Harry Potter, it may actually be. We don't know. Harry asked Dumbledore, is all of this happening in my head? What does Dumbledore say? Yes. But, yeah, I heard somebody. That doesn't make it any less real. Exactly. So Harry is somebody who embodies all of these values that we think of as Christian values. Voldemort, on the other hand, embodies everything that we should dislike about our culture. And so one of the things that I think is kind of funny, it's important when we do spiritual readings to recognize that it's not just positive spiritual values that are transmitted to us. There's also negative. Sometimes when I talk about Harry Potter, I ask the question, I say, isn't it important to know what Voldemort does? And then do the opposite? It's like this old episode of Seinfeld where George, the really neurotic little bald guy, realized that he always made the wrong decision. And so he started doing the opposite of what he intended to do in the first place. What would Voldemort do is a perfectly legitimate spiritual question. We should get bracelets. We really should. Now, here's where I want to end tonight. I said that I wanted to close with love. We've talked about friendship and community. We've talked about caritas and cupidity. Love is the deeper magic of Harry Potter's world, if I could use C.S. Lewis's term from the Chronicles of Narnia. In each of the novels, it is love that undergirds every powerful thing that happens. And I know that it seems naive to talk about love. I know it seems naive. And yet the truth is, as we see it in Harry Potter's world, love is the most powerful, the most countercultural, the most earth-shaking of all things. It's also the thing that we are called to do. Augustine talks about it in a lot of places. I love how he says that we can't read Scripture unless we understand that every reading of Scripture has got to be informed by our understanding of the twofold commandment of love. And then Aquinas says it, I think actually even a little more directly. Let's see if I can find this. My son's trying to text me. It's not permitted during a... Yeah, this is my favorite. This is like maybe the boiling down of Christian love. The law of divine love is the standard for all human action. When a human action does not conform to the standard of love, it is not right, nor good, nor perfect. Now, as I said, love seems sentimental. I've got the Beatles playing in the back of my head. All you need is love. We think about flower power, the 1960s. We're going to change the world with our transformative love. But love, nonetheless, is what we're called to. Here's what Pope Benedict said. Charity, caritas, in truth, to which Jesus Christ bore witness by his earthly life, and especially by his death and resurrection, is the principal driving force behind the authentic development of every person and of all humanity. Love, caritas, is an extraordinary force which leads people to opt for courageous and generous engagement in the field of justice and peace. It is a force that has its origin in God, eternal love, and absolute truth. Is love naive? Is it weak? I think of Martin Luther King, getting up every morning of his adult life knowing he might be killed that day for standing up for what he believed in. I think of Harry's mother, standing in front of her child knowing it meant her death. Love is what makes the heroic possible. It really is. When we see Harry walk into the forest to offer himself up to Voldemort's wrath, he does it not because he's the bravest or the smartest or the most powerful, not because he has any of those qualities that we associate with success in our culture. He does it because he loves. He loves those who have fought for him, those who have lost their lives, and those that he thinks will live in a better world because of his actions. And that is truly Christ-like. Is it love again? Voldemort mocks. But the answer is yes. Again. Always. The secret of life. The secret we learn from Jesus, from Paul, from Augustine, from J.K. Rowling, is that love is the deeper magic that rescues and redeems us, that puts the world right. And that, I think, is a really nice place for us to stop. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Chris, do we have time for some questions? Okay, a few questions for folks that would like to stay for just a moment. Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
I noticed that the characters that you said that showed the most like sympathy, empathy for others were the ones that had some kind of adversity.
Nice.
For example, Harry being an orphan and Hermione that didn't have any friends because she was too smart. But Dumbledore, we even seen in Dumbledore when he was younger, he wasn't that good of a guy.
Yeah.
When terrible things happened to him with his family, that's when he had formed his real values that would make him so successful later in life. So do you think it's adversity which shapes people into being good people?
That's a really great question. The question was, all the characters that we talked about in the lecture tonight who evince that kind of empathy and compassion are people who have, at some point in their lives, been badly hurt or have made bad mistakes. And I think that's, just looking at my own life, I think that that's true. That, our ability to empathize with other people is increased by our understanding of their imperfection and our own imperfection. Augustine, of course, was profoundly influenced by St. Anthony and the Desert Mothers and Fathers. And one of the things that we learned from them is that they were rigorously honest about their own faults. But when it came to loving and judging other people, that rigorous honesty, that awareness of their own failure, made them much more compassionate toward the failures of others. And I think that probably you're right, that that's one of the things that allows those characters to have some sense of how other people might feel. It's a great question. Do you have a follow-up?
Because for example, Ron, that we don't see him as a compassionate character. I think it's in the 7th book when they're traveling through different places that Harry mentioned, that the reason why Hermione and him are taking it quite well, and Ron is the one that's having so much difficulties, is because Ron always had a caring family that he
Right.
had food. And yet Ron still ends up being like a bit morally a better character than Voldemort, who had adversity.
Yeah.
What do you think? The whole series we see all these similarities between Voldemort and Harry. What do you think is that element that made them so different? That made them take so different routes?
Well, Rowling tells us early in the series that personal choice matters, even when Harry is sorted. He is able to choose which house he's going to go into. And, Dumbledore tells him at one point, it's not how you are alike, but how you're different. It's a very sort of, existential way of thinking about identity, that we're formed by our choices as well as by community or the lack of community. But largely we could say that, Harry is a person who has love genetically encoded in his veins. It's the only way to understand how he turns out the way he does, because he has no moral formation for the first 10 years of his life. But, love is the value that saves him, and, there's no biological understanding of that, but there certainly is a spiritual one. That's a great question. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah. So, in talking about community, I keep struggling with Snape, just because you can argue all of his communities have failed him. He's tried to become a part of community. He doesn't find it with the Death Eaters. Ultimately, the friendship that he thinks he's found with Dumbledore has, in a sense, betrayed him in the moment that he realizes that Harry needs to die.
Right.
But he does it anyway. So really, in the end, he's gone beyond the love that's motivated him. Do you think that's some sense of community or desire to create community for others that he's dying for?
That's a great question. Snape is still such a problematic character. We've seen the whole series, and I'm still not sure we totally get him. And I am still honestly a little bit leery of this whole romantic love. I love Lily Potter so much. That to me smacks a little bit too much of cupiditas, of loving that which will disappear. And it makes me think of Augustine mourning the loss of his friend, So I don't know, it seems to me that just in terms of spiritual and Christian values, Snape has chosen to love something which is not God and which is not lasting and which ultimately vanishes, and then he finds meaning in another thing that is not lasting. And I think one of the most tragic things about him is that loneliness and solitude, because we discover this whole secret history. And we want to embrace him and pull him back into the fold. And that's, in literary terms, that's what the epilogue is about. When Harry says to his son, you were named after 2 headmasters of Hogwarts, and one of them was one of the bravest men I ever knew. It's not salvation for him as a character, but it's something for us to embrace in terms of the narrative, that we understood and the story understands that there was something noble about what he did, however misguided parts of his life might have been. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, just because I feel like there has to be something else. Because if it was just love, he wouldn't have kept going, even though he realized that Harry had to die.
Yeah.
It would have been over for him.
Yeah.
So I feel like, I don't know if it's community, I don't know if it's something else, but I think that there had to be something else there.
That's nice. There could be some good papers written about Snape.
Yeah.
Just saying. Good. Let's take maybe one more. You guys have been so good.
I'm actually writing my senior thesis on Tolkien and kind of situating him within World War I. It's similar to how you were talking about Harry Potter kind of bringing these meanings of friendship and loyalty in kind of like a post-Christian Britain. Tolkien was kind of writing
Nice.
when, justice and morality were kind of shattered by
Yeah.
World War I. And I think I've seen kind of a consistency that the fantasy genre is able to kind of bring us back to these fundamental values in ways that maybe realistic fiction doesn't really. And I was just wondering if you had any insight as into why fantasy kind of has this.
Sure. That's actually the first chapter in my book. Let me give you 2 or 3 things, and this is a really nice question for us to close on, because this kind of pulls a lot of things together. We recognize, hey, this is taking place during my time, my place, my space. It's hard for us to learn the moral lessons that are sort of embedded in it. And what science fiction or fantasy or horror can do is they can cause us to forget that we are viewing a universal human story. William Faulkner used to say that every great story is about the universal human truths. And that's true whether it's a werewolf story or a fantasy story or a science fiction epic. So they're all about, why are we here? What is it that we're supposed to be doing? What is the meaning of life? What is community? What is heroism? And so in something like The Lord of the Rings, in something like The Chronicles of Narnia, in something like Harry Potter, we are able to see those qualities in a slightly different way because it's not exactly our world. And I think that's a really interesting way that we can kind of think about the moral value of fantasy or fairy tale. Brilliant. That's a great question. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. Have a wonderful evening. God bless.